Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Turn the Page podcast. I am here today with an author who wrote one of the most unique books I have ever read. And it's called The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy.
Yes.
It's so good. So please,
thank you.
I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell us about the book and where this whole story came from, because it's lovely.
Well, thank you. That's so nice. So I'm Megan Bannen, and I am a former children's librarian turned full-time writer. I know, librarian.
Wait,
high five.
Former children's librarian here too. High five. Through Zoom. Zoom high five. No one can see this because we're not actually using the video, but I can see Megan doing it.
We did, in fact, air five. So I always kind of thought I would write novels, but I think I thought that in the same way. I think things like someday I will get in shape and someday I will eat kale all the time, and like things that you may have the best of intentions of doing, but you don't actually get around to doing them. And then finally in my late 30s, it occurred to me that I was never going to write a book unless I sat down and wrote a book. And so that's how I started writing. Undertaking of Hart and Mercy is my third book, but it is my first book for adults. My first two books are young adult novels. As far as what this book is about, it is really hard to pitch this book in a way that makes it sound even remotely normal.
It's not,
I guess
though, and
it's
that's
not.
what I love about it. I love that it's not normal. That is one of my favorite things about this book, is just how unique it is.
It is, but it also makes it hard to describe it to people. And I mean, basically, I wanted to write a rom-com in a fantasy setting, but I've also always wanted to write a fantasy setting that didn't feel European, but at the same time was from kind of a background that I can write about more authoritatively. So I really wanted to write kind of a more American feeling fantasy setting, and particularly kind of a Midwest, Old West sort of fantasy setting. And so I shoved all of that into one book. And it's the story of Hart Ralston, who is a marshal in this part of the world where there's a problem with the undead. And so he has to protect people from the undead. And the problem is when he vanquishes one of these reanimated bodies, he now has a body he has to do something with. And so he takes it to an undertaker. And that means he has to run into Mercy Birdsall of Birdsall and Son Undertakers on a regular basis. And these two have never gotten along. They've always butted heads. They just can't stand each other. But they're both also secretly very lonely people. And Hart one day just pours his heart out, no pun intended, into a letter addressed simply to a friend. And he places it in a mailbox, and he does not expect to get an answer because it's addressed to no one. But it turns out that the mail service in this world is magical. And that letter magically gets delivered by a talking owl to Mercy. And Mercy also really needs a friend right now. And so these two start this anonymous correspondence writing to a friend. And meanwhile, they're constantly butting heads in reality. And as they grow closer as correspondents, they think, well, maybe this could be something more. And so things really get interesting when they meet for the first time. And meanwhile, the undead problem is getting worse and worse. And so that's the kind of setup of the story in a nutshell.
I mean, obviously, I want to ask you, so much about it, but I don't want to give anything away. But one of the things I thought of while I was reading it is how much this book, it reminded me of You've Got Mail, but I liked it better.
Thank you.
So much better.
Because nobody's shutting down the nice independent bookstore, maybe?
No, but at the same time, you do, so, there was a lot, it was a lot richer. Rom-coms for me I can sort of take them or leave them depending on the premise. And I love this magical rom-com paranormal romance. But this was just so unique. I mean, it had a very like light possession, necromancy, death plot, which I thought was very cool. I just really loved Mercy and Hart. They were just so much fun to read, and you could really feel their loneliness, especially Mercy, who is like very much trying to take care of her family and deal with her family legacy, which is this undertaking business, which is actually Mercy's business was kind of like the small independent bookstore, because there's another undertaking company that's trying to co-opt them. So in a way, yes, somebody was. It just was not an independent bookstore.
Yeah, the bad guy is the one trying to shut down the small business. Hello, that's what villains do, not romantic leads.
Yes, exactly. Oh, yes, that's
opinion.
true. There you go. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. So yeah, that was fun. Mercy is just so like she's so loving to her family and her brother who's supposed to be taking the place, in undertaking. Just the way that you kind of described the job was very cathartic, if that makes sense.
No, I that's exactly what I was going for with that. I think, the book is a rom com, and it is light and fluffy, but
it's
also
very
about
light
death.
and fluffy. Yes, fluffy.
Fluffy.
It's very light and fluffy, but it is, yes.
And that was something I really, when I set out to write the book, was kind of at the heart of the book. This was like late 2019, early 2020. I remember coming across an article or two, maybe, talking about how we deal with death in American society. And one of them, and I have not been able to find it. I could swear it was like an op-ed in the New York Times, but it was a doctor talking about how when a patient has exhausted care and they have a terminal illness, like she's the one they would always send in to basically tell this person, this is it, you're dying, and how do you want to proceed from here? And I think they even called her the angel of death at this hospital, and but she just wrote this beautiful article about how we don't face death, and how death is kind of this transactional thing that happens somewhere else. We don't look at it. It's almost like not real for us. And I don't know, it just really struck me. It was very touching, and it hit home. So I think there is that vein hanging out in this book of facing mortality, and how that really leads to you figuring out what it means to really live your life.
Yeah, without a doubt. It was really, it was really nice, and it was just very funny to watch them sort of like stumble around each other and try to figure out who the other one was. Hart was interesting though, because so Hart doesn't really have a family. He had a mentor, but he's also a demigod. How does religion and deity play into the story?
Yeah, religion is something that always seems to creep into what I'm writing, whether I meant to or not. I think the way it got into this book was in a really backdoor kind of way. And I love telling this story because it involves my agent, Holly Root, who is the best literary agent in the universe. I don't care if anyone thinks their agent is better, because they are wrong. And I love Holly, and I love kind of throwing ideas around with Holly. And so I first started talking about this book with her in like January 2020. And it was more a conversation of, I don't know what to write next. Maybe this thing, maybe that thing. I don't know. Nothing's calling to me. And she said, Megan, look, you can write whatever you want right now. You're not on contract. So go nuts, get weird. And when you have 5 chapters, send them my way and we'll see if it has legs. I'm like, okay. So when I had 5 chapters, probably around March, I sent them her way, and she loved the book. But all the fantasy elements of the book were kind of more in Hart's Hart section. Like the rest of the world was kind of just our world. And she thought that the whole thing needed to be more fantastical. And so she was talking specifically about funeral rites because the funeral industry in the original draft or the original first 5 chapters was very much the way it works here in our world. And Holly said, Megan, have you ever watched The Mandalorian? And I said, yes. And she said, you know, Baby Yoda's
So
baby stroller. And I'm like, and immediately, you know, I knew what she was talking about, that little like floating pod that carries Baby Yoda. And I'm like, well, yeah. She goes, you know how it's not a baby stroller, but we understand that that's that world's version of a baby stroller? I'm like, yeah. And she says, you need the Baby Yoda's baby stroller, the funeral industry in this book. Okay. So like a week later, I did all this research into um, specifically kind of there's already a little bit of Greek mythology kind of influence hanging out in the book. And I looked a little more into kind of more Nordic mythology as well. I was looking at death rituals from around the world, but I wanted to make sure whatever I was kind of being inspired from was something that someone from my background could, you know, tastefully
fair
incorporate.
enough. Yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
I
Yeah.
don't want to appropriate someone else's funeral rites. That's kind of
Yeah.
gross. So anyway, I started kind of like looking around, particularly at ancient Greece and kind of more the Nordic cultures, and kind of came up with this idea. And there's only, by the way, there's only so many ways to get rid of a dead body. I mean, really, I've done some fascinating research, but there's
So wait a second. Like, what kind of how often did the police come to your door while you?
I know. Let me tell you, my like internet search history must be on like 5 different FBI watch lists. I'm constantly researching very interesting things. But you know, it is interesting about like we have to deal with human remains, but there's actually limited ways to deal with human remains. You know, like you can bury them, you can burn them, you can do like a sea burial, you could do sky burial, which is very interesting. There's also kind of more of like a coral sky burial. That's when there are many cultures where the body is set up high somewhere and vultures actually consume the body.
Wait, what?
Yeah, and then like you kind of, you know, it's really beautiful. You're kind of taken to the sky, you know, and it's actually extremely efficient. Um, so anyway, I'm looking at all these different things, and I kind of, because I was looking a little bit at more the Nordic way of doing things, and I you know, and then it kind of created this world of islands, right? We have a series of islands, and there's water culture involved. I'm like, well, then maybe like they are buried in boats, you know, like the
Loved it.
Anglo-Saxons.
Loved it.
I'm like, yeah, and there's this whole mythology of sailing the salt sea, and so like in a week, I kind of coughed up this whole religious system. I had a really good time with it, and I revised the book and passed it on to Holly, and she's like, how did you take Baby Yoda's baby stroller and make this? But it was once I kind of figured it's really interesting. Once I kind of figured out what the funeral rites look like, the whole kind of mythology and religion of the world fell into place, and it became a really important part of the book.
Yeah, no, it was beautiful, and there was just so much about it, and I don't, you know, I like I said, I don't want to give too much away. It's a journey that the reader really does need to go on, and it is breathtaking. There are just so many great characters in this book. But one thing that I thought was really interesting, and I sort of had to look into it, is this idea that your soul rests in your appendix.
Yeah, that this is this is another one of those Megan's mind works in mysterious ways kind of thing, because the reason that came about was I had always envisioned Hart as this tall guy with a rapier. I don't know why he had a rapier, but he's always had a rapier. And so it's like, well, why does he have a rapier? And like this Western feeling fantasy world, like that's not a very Westernish kind of implement of death. And so what's the rapier for? I'm like, well, you know, rapier's like really precise. It's kind of a thrusting sort of sword. And I'm like, well, why would you need something like that? And I thought, well, maybe if we're having an undead problem and we're having to deal with like souls, maybe you have to like be very precise in what you're hitting, and maybe the soul lives in the appendix. Maybe that's the purpose of the human appendix. Mystery solved. And so that was the way that part of the mythology came about.
Fabulous. So I guess my last thing I just wanted to know is, would you write another book in this world?
Um, I hope so. I would love to write another book in this world. So, stay tuned and we'll see what the publishing gods have in store.
I guess like I also want to know, so you like The Mandalorian. What other what's the rest of, like what other stuff are you influenced by or just love?
What other stuff do okay, oh my gosh. This is where I just blank and freak
I
out
know
because
this
it's,
is like what this is like what the patron asks the librarian. Do you have a recommendation for a book? And you're just like,
yeah, and mine
book.
goes blank. Yes, I have to like walk people over to the shelves and look at what's there. And then I'm like, oh, this, and this. So like there are things, I'm sure there are things that have influenced me, but I think I tend to think of the things I love and the things that have influenced me separate. Because I think I don't even know what influences me. Especially for this book. I don't know. Obviously there's elements of like shop around the corner. Um, you've got mail hanging out in there just because it is, you know, the friend, the, what do you call it? Enemies to lovers pen pal trope, right? So that's been around for a bit. And there is even like a scene in The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy that's like the little fun homage to shop around the corner and you've got mail. Um, but the rest of that book was really just me having a rollicking good time in quarantine. So, but as far as like what I love and what
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying right now, I recently watched Mr. Sunshine on Netflix, and
I need to watch that.
absolutely, oh my god, everything about that show was my jam. That was like the most Megan show I've ever watched ever. So I love that. Other shows that I think have influenced me would definitely be the Nirvana and Fire series. Like there's some, they're available on Viki, so you can watch that for free on Viki as long as you're willing to watch the commercials. But it's a wonderful Chinese television drama, and I took notes watching this thing just because it's executed so well. And so someday I think I learned, and I think I would love to kind of incorporate some of the things that I learned from that series into a book. As far as books I've really been enjoying lately, I love Freya Marsk's writing so much. A Marvelous Light and A Restless Truth comes out in less than a week, I think. And those books are fantastic. That's a true romance fantasy mashup done absolutely beautifully. And Freya's writing is just so good, and the magic system, and she just writes characters I'd take a bullet for. So I love that series. And Alexis Hall has single-handedly gotten me through 2020, which has been a challenging year.
Oh,
3 o'clock in
2020
the
is still
morning.
happening somehow. Like
I
20,
know it's like
it's like
every year
Russian
just gets like
doll.
worse.
Like you
Yes.
every year you're like, okay, here we go. Gotta get up. We're back where we started.
I
Yay!
know it's still terrible. So I mean, I've been up at like I can't count how many times I've been up at 3 in the morning and I can't sleep, and I've been reading an Alexis Hall book and laughing. Oh my God, he is just magnificent. So those are some of the things I've really been enjoying lately. Oh, and also I've got to put in a plug for the book Belittled Women, which is a young adult novel by Amanda Soleil coming out next month. And it is, I really think Amanda's a genius. I think she is a literal genius, and she's definitely a comic genius. It is about a family in a small town in Kansas, and there's three girls, and their mom is obsessed with Little Women to the point where she has turned their home into a Little Women tourist attraction called Little Women Live. And the girls, who are named Meg, Joe, and Amy Beth, because she was afraid she wouldn't have like another daughter, so she got Amy Beth in the last one. And Amy Beth goes more for Amy than Beth, so they have to audition a new Beth every year. Oh my God. Anyway, they all have to play their roles in this horrible little little women tourist attraction. It is just
Wow.
wonderful. So
thank you so much. Please come back. I loved talking to you. Super fun.
Librarian, high five again. I always love talking to librarians.
All right. So once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Check out Undertaking of Hart and Mercy by Megan Bannen. Get at your bookstore, your library, anywhere. It is gorgeous. It had like a special edition, didn't it, with like illustrations?
Yeah, that was the Fairy Loot edition.
So
that was
pretty.
part of their adult subscription. It's so pretty. Yes.
So thank you again. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.